by climate change. Because in both cases, the actions of people carrying out their kind of normal free behavior is making people who are very vulnerable, is disproportionately impacting particular communities, those who are very old, those who are economically disadvantaged, and communities of color. And so there's this kind of justice issue flows both from the pandemic and from climate change. And so we argued that we needed, and this was in June, so before there was really kind of mask mandates, that we needed to, since people weren't voluntarily changing their behavior, there needed to be more nudges, incentivization, and legal compulsion on people to protect vulnerable individuals and communities. Okay, I will stop there. I will stop screen sharing too. There we go.
Great, thank you so much, Claire. All right, our next panelist will go to Carly Purdom. Carly, would you like to go ahead and share your slides?
Okay, can everyone see my slides? Great. So today I'm going to talk about incarcerated populations and as an overlooked vulnerable population in terms of coastal communities and disasters. So my research very broadly focuses on the impact of hazards and disasters on incarcerated populations. So today I'm going to kind of talk about some of the reasons that they're vulnerable and some of the different issues that they're facing, and then also how COVID-19 has increased their vulnerability in terms of not just with COVID-19, but to other hazards and disasters and the environmental justice concerns that come along with that. So in talking about the vulnerability of prisoners in disasters, incarcerated persons are primarily seen as vulnerable because they have no agency to take protective actions. So they have to fully rely on prison administrations and prison staff to make those decisions as to are they going to be evacuated? They have to get resources to them. They can't go out and get resources for themselves. So they have to completely rely on the state agency to kind of protect them. Prison locations, and this is becoming an enormous issue in coastal areas, but the locations of prisons put incarcerated populations and staff at risk. When prisons were built many years ago during the kind of prison boom in the US in the 1980s, 1990s, there's this need for large tracts of cheap land, and there wasn't as much of a concern for what are the hazards in that area. Furthermore, prisons are also more likely to be located in rural areas, so they're kind of cut off from access to emergency services that more urban areas have. In terms of emergency management planning, there's limited guidance for how prisons should plan and prepare for hazards and disasters. There's a stronger emphasis on things like riots or escapes that are seen as impacting the outer community or as being caused by prisoners, instead of focusing on the kinds of events that prisoners themselves are vulnerable to. They are also secure populations, so that also presents many complicated challenges, such as can local responders get in? Can evacuation happen quickly? And evacuation is becoming, and has been for some time, but it's becoming an even more complicated and pressing issue, especially in coastal states. So, for example, Hurricane Harvey prompted the evacuation of more than 6,000 incarcerated persons. And just recently with Hurricane Laura, there were more than 900 incarcerated persons evacuated in Louisiana and more than 3,600 evacuated in Texas in the middle of a pandemic, when you have lockdowns and they're trying to limit the movement of incarcerated persons. They're having to evacuate them due to flooding. Incarcerated populations are also vulnerable because of social stigma. So one of the probably the most visible impact of a disaster on a prison was the impact of Hurricane Katrina on the Orleans Parish Prison, where prisoners were left while the rest of the community evacuated, because the local officials said that that is where prisoners belong. The sheriff said the prisoners will stay where they belong. We're not going to evacuate them. And because of that, the prison was flooded and prisoners were left in chest-high waters for days. When they tried to escape, they were seen as, criminals trying to escape, and so they were met with a kind of violent response. So part of enduring disasters is often tied to their punishment. Often the things that they say about what they're experiencing is not trusted by local media sources or by government officials. They're kind of painted as, because they're criminals, they cannot be trusted to tell the truth about what's going on in their environment. And also because they're kind of a stigmatized population, they end up being low priority for resources. They're also difficult to access in terms of accountability. So it's hard for outsiders to gain access to prisons and incarcerated populations during an emergency or disaster. Incarcerated workers also have a significant role in disasters. And as disasters are growing in number and in capacity for damage, that role continues to expand. The impacts on incarcerated populations are becoming more visible. When you have discussions like, they tend to focus on wildland firefighters, but I recently wrote a piece for The Conversation about how the large majority of states in the US plan to use incarcerated workers for a large number of disasters, including hurricanes, flooding, for debris cleanup, for just a number of tasks. Right now with the COVID-19 outbreak, they have been working in factories to produce PPE, to produce different materials needed by state agencies. And in the context of what we call mass incarceration, where the United States has the incarcerated population has increased by 500, 600% over the last several decades, prisons are crowded, they're underfunded, and there's a lack of rights for incarcerated workers. So the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution states that incarcerated persons don't have the right to refuse to work. So that's kind of the environment they're in, where they may be subjected to working in a condition such as post-disaster, where they don't have the right to refuse to do that, even if they perceive the environment to be dangerous. So one example of the vulnerability of incarcerated workers is from the state of Georgia. Their state laws say that inmates should not be forced to work during or required to work in the rain or during periods of inclement weather conditions which jeopardize the health of those concerned, except during times of emergency conditions where life or public property is in danger. So you can see how in an emergency situation, the rights of incarcerated people are restricted even more. So in talking about broadly concerns with environmental justice, like I mentioned before, the prison system has dramatically expanded since the 1970s. We went from having less than 300,000 people incarcerated in the nation to more than 2.2 million people incarcerated. The state prisons are, it costs $60 billion a year to run the state prison industry. And those who are incarcerated reflect the most vulnerable communities. So racial and ethnic minorities, low-income families, and people living in spatially marginal settings. So people from communities that have these restricted access to resources. And even in prison emergency planning materials, they say to prepare for incarcerated persons to need access to increased mental health resources, because they expect that it is their families and their communities that are going to have the worst impact in any kind of disaster. And it is in that context where prison agencies right now are planning for a future of climate change, where we have more disasters, more hazards, increased impact from hazards, and more people incarcerated. So this quote is from a federal, from the National Institute of Corrections, looking at the need for resilience in prisons. It says wildfires in Colorado, hurricanes and flooding in New Orleans and New Jersey, flooding in Iowa, drought in California, sea level rise, water shortages, calls for diversion for other water sources, extreme heat in Texas, extreme snowfall, ice, tests of an aging power grid, transportation issues, rising in social and individual costs for health, a lack of access to fuels, and more crime, primarily violent, ... the future. And as we can see, many of these things that they are planning for, they're already happening and have been happening for some time. And they're seeing these impacts to correctional facilities, but they're planning for a future where the system is even more untenable. And throughout in the report, they call for a reduction in incarcerated populations. So right now my work is on, I've joined a team of other international researchers looking at the impact of COVID-19 on prisons in the context of other hazards and disasters. And through that work, these are my specific findings on how COVID-19 has kind of exacerbated these issues. Are previous disasters have shaped how COVID-19 is impacting incarcerated populations. So for example, when there are hurricanes and storms and they damage prison housing, prisoners are put in temporary facilities that are characteristically crowded. So they have even smaller spaces. And so COVID-19 is spreading through those facilities at an even higher rate. COVID-19 complicates emergency management in the carceral setting. So when we're having to evacuate prisons and evacuate these institutions, they're having to do that in the context of a contagious pandemic. Hazards are complicating the management of COVID. So when they do those evacuations, they're causing more outbreaks in those facilities into receiving institutions. And the simultaneous presence of COVID-19 and other disasters like the hurricanes or wildfires in the states in the West, they're having a compounded impact physically and mentally on incarcerated persons and their families and prison staff. So in all of that, they are, the convergence of those two issues is supporting more conversations about how do we respond to our overcrowded prison system, and what are steps we can do to reduce that incarcerated population as a fundamental step of hazard mitigation and as a necessary concern for the vulnerability of this population. And so with that, I will close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carly. All right, and our final panelist today, Joy Simeon. Joy, would you like to go ahead and begin?
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Joy Simeon, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys about coastal hazards, race, and social justice. I actually grew up in a fence line community, so I got involved into coastal hazards because it was right in front of my face. There was always hurricanes, there were chemical spills, there were industrial spills, there were explosions, you name it, we had it. And so when I went to school, I graduated from Dillard University and with my bachelor's. But when I went there, I went with the intentions of making a difference. I wanted to know what was impacting my community and why, and then what could we do about it. And so after I got my bachelor's from Dillard University, I went into Texas Southern University and got my master's. And then now I'm here with Dr. Michelle Meyer, and I'm looking at organizational recovery and how those coastal hazards really impact organizations and communities. And so one of the biggest things for me is understanding communities and understanding how and what is impacting them at all times, especially as it relates to like race and social justice. One of the things that I really enjoy doing is looking at trainings and understanding how to increase the capacity of communities to respond to disasters. so that they can figure out what policies need to be developed within their own communities, figure out what resources that they need to obtain, and then being able to have the ability to go out and do that. One of the things that I like to say is that I'm seeking a career that is as an interdisciplinary multi-hazard research scientist and community capacity builder. And what I mean by that is I never want to be one person. So I never want to be a researcher or just a professor or just a politician. I wanted to be able to touch all the networks and be able to communicate with each one of those networks and try to be the in-between person. And so one of the things that I wanted my research to do whenever I got to Texas A&M was incorporate all those things. And so the project that I'm currently working on is in Southeast Texas. And so we're in Beaumont and Port Arthur, and we're interviewing nonprofits and also businesses to find out about their experiences with Hurricane Harvey, with their multi-hazard impacts. So that same community has been impacted by chemical spills. It's been impacted by COVID. It has been impacted by another tropical storm since we've been there surveying, and we've been doing that for the last 2 years. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in looking at with that project is looking at nonprofits and how do they go into communities and how do they say, okay, well, what do we need? What kind of resources do I need to be able to help those communities and the people that live within them? But then also, how do they really be able to recover themselves? Because it's not enough. We're always trying to help somebody else, but then how do we succeed in the things that we're doing? And so that's one of the questions that I had for some of those nonprofits. And so hopefully by the end of the project, we'll be able to come up with a tangible project or deliverable that they can take to the communities that they work with and say, well, this is how you recover if you're a business, if you're a nonprofit, or any of those in that nature. And so what we find with coastal communities is that a lot of them are impacted multiple times with multiple different types of disasters, right? So like I said, we can have hurricanes, we can have tornadoes, we can have floods, we can have industry explosions, you name it, they're constantly getting hit. So how do we go in and explore why they're being impacted and how do we reduce those impacts? And then who are they impacting, right? So are they only impacting African Americans or Hispanics or minorities or women? Who exactly are they impacting and why? And is it because of historical problems that have origins way back to slavery and Jim Crow that we need to mitigate policies and change things that are in place now? Or is it something new that we're doing, and how do we make that difference? And so we've seen this all the time, right? Like we've been able to explore this in all types of research, from education research to hazard research. It's all there. We just need to figure out ways to unpack it more and come up with tangible deliverables so we can help those communities. And so that's one of the reasons why I really like working for the Hazard Reduction Recovery Center, is because it's not just about research, but it's about turning that research into action. It's about turning those actions and making an actual difference. So when you find centers like the Hazard Reduction Recovery Center and the Institute for Sustainability, those centers really make a difference in the communities that we work with, because we're not just doing research, but we're also making a change. So I've done a lot of projects from the time I was at Dillard to the time that I've worked at the Hazard Reduction Recovery Center. And one of the greatest things that I started doing was making a list of things that we can do to actually make a difference in the communities that we work with. And so I came up with 10 things that I've been sharing ever since I've just been working with the Hazard Reduction Recovery Center and other centers as well. And so the first one is have regular, open, and honest conversations with colleagues, family members, and friends to discuss environmental racism. We all know environmental racism exists, but why does it exist, and what can we do to reduce it, right? And so one of those ways, being able to have a conversation, because if you can't have a conversation, then you can't change anything. And then be able to hear what the other person is saying. The second is to challenge colleagues, family members, and friends to actively challenge disparities, right? So if we know something exists, challenge it. Why does it exist, right? What can we do to make a difference? And don't just accept it. Number 3, I grew up in a fence line community, so actively monitoring environmental problems and contacting local representatives and environmental agency officials to report environmental incidents is really important, because if we can see that there's an explosion, if we can see that there's a flame, but we never report it, then how do we ever expect there's a difference to be made? And every voice matters when it comes to industrial explosions and even just environmental justices, period. Number 4, hold individuals and industries accountable through the judicial and legislative systems for actions that violate the health and welfare of communities. If we can put people in our communities in jail for the things that they do wrong, why can't we put the people that are polluting those same chemicals in jail? Those same communities in jail. Number 5, encourage education systems like Texas A&M to develop rigorous curricula that discuss racial disparities and environmental issues. One of the things that I really like working with Dr. Meyer and Dr. Davis is that they incorporate those things into their classes. They find ways that we can understand what's going on and then have discussions on how to mitigate those things. Number 6, develop mentor and mentee programs that encourage, educate, empowers young people of color to become advocates for their communities. We don't know, we can't do what we don't know. So if you don't teach us, then how do you expect for us to do it? So go into communities, go into high schools, go into undergraduate programs and recruit and ask them, what is their experience with coastal hazards, race and social justices, and how can we bridge those gaps together? Number 7, regularly promote the work of environmental advocates and leaders in the field that diligently work to reduce environmental disparities. So, become an environmental advocate. Don't just do the research, actually make a change. Number 8, volunteer with community organizations who seek to make a difference. And then number 9, collaborate with local leaders to create opportunities to reduce disparities within communities, because that's really important. You can't just go into a community and expect them to all listen to you. They've been living there for centuries, some people. And so it's important to develop a collaboration rather than you just going in and be a dictatorship. And so once you can be able to work with people, then a change can truly be made. And then, of course, support organizations who seek to support and expand diversity and inclusion. One of the things that I was able to become a part of since I've been at Texas A&M is the Bill Anderson Fund. And so their job or their role is to really heavily recruit minority students and trying to expand diversity, inclusion, and hazards. And so if we can help support organizations like the Bill Anderson Fund or like other organizations that's really trying to make a difference and pull other young people, especially minorities, into the fields that we're in, then we can really see the growth of diversity within the next couple of years. So with that said, it was an honor to present to you this afternoon, and I just hope you found the concepts discussed were both interesting and useful. So I'm available for questions and comments.
All right, thank you so much, Joy, and thank you everyone, to all of our panelists. This is a wonderful, obviously quick snapshot of really great work that each scholar is doing. And so, of course, please go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A box. And I think as we let questions roll in, we held back one question to kind of open this discussion for our panelists to talk to each other and think about the intersections that we have across the different work that's presented here, even though we all come from very different backgrounds and disciplinary focuses, and how that kind of interconnects together. So that question is, if you could speak to what key concepts or conceptual debates, theories, or methods are really motivating your work along the lines of coastal justice. And I'll let you guys pop in whatever order, whoever wants to hop up first.
Michelle, can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, so it is, what key concepts or conceptual debates or theories or methods are really motivating your work?
Well, one thing that motivates me specifically, and the desire to kind of understand many of these communities, especially environmental justice communities, started back when I lived in Illinois, and specifically when I learned about renewable energy development that would occur in our community, and how much of the issues surrounding what was being exposed in the media about the solar panel array, it wasn't the fact that this community was uneducated about the benefits of solar panels, but it was their attachment to the land and the community that the solar panels were going to be placed on. And that was not getting recognition at all. The community members, their tie to this community dealt a lot with family members who had worked at the Creosote plant there that was no longer there, but had a lot of anecdotal evidence of many of the ailments that the members who worked at this plant faced. But a lot of this stuff went unknown or in a way unacknowledged. And that desire to kind of seek that knowledge and go into these communities to really see what was going on, and using whatever platform I had to kind of bring that to the forefront, specifically for the local government who was kind of making this decision to develop on that land. So that kind of drove me. And again, this is going on all across the US, where we have these communities that have these strong connections to lands that are being inundated with different pollutants and have been, but these are people's homes. These are people's connection and their land. So that drives a lot of my desire to go into research that deals really with community members, their participation in environmental development, and how they navigate that system.
I could actually pick up on that. And I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. And that I think has also been important to some of the work that I've done. So I was recently on a National Academy of Science committee that was looking at the possibility of genetically modifying trees in order to make them resistant to various kinds of diseases. So, you know, like the American chestnut, which has been practically eradicated. But one of the things that we did as a committee was talk to groups of tribal communities about how they felt if there were genetically modified trees that were moving onto their land, because obviously that would happen if you were planting wild trees that were GM trees. And you know, their responses were very interesting. I mean, there wasn't just one single response. So one thing is, you know, there might be an outside view is that, you know, everyone is going to think the same thing in this community, and they didn't. But the thought was, you know, that some of the people expressed the view, you know, the trees were like family members, and that, you know, how would you feel about genetically modifying family members? Should we, and there was a very different kind of approach to thinking about why land matters and what kinds of relationships it's appropriate to have with land. And I think that to recognize people's cultures in justice issues means thinking really, even where the worldview is something that's very different from the one that you're coming from, it's very important to be able to recognize that. So, and I think that follows on from what Deidre was saying. It's another kind of, to recognize someone means to recognize cultural views and attachments to lands and places that may not be sort of obvious if you're coming from the outside.
Absolutely. And that was so good, Claire. And it makes me think about the urban planner itself, you know, him and herself. These are things that we really have to make sure that we consider when we go into these areas to develop, although our desire and plan and motives are great for the community, but we have to make sure that there's a public participation part, engagement in there, that we're really making sure we are reaching out to see what the people need who's actually going to benefit from this. Because once we develop or do, you know, our due diligence, we're out of there and we've left a community to deal with whatever we have brought there. So that's extremely important to make sure that we are incorporating the desires of communities in their own community, you know?
Just to build, so I think one of the things that drives me is community-based participatory research, because I learned a lot about that when I was getting my master's at TSU. And so one of the things that I really believe in is being able to go into a community, but find the key stakeholders that actually know what the community needs. And so one of the things that I like about my project that I'm working on with in Southeast Texas is the fact that I get to talk to the nonprofits and figure out, okay, what are the issues that you have? What are the things that you're experiencing so that we can actually turn that research into an action item? And as far as the theories, the 3 theories that I've been studying for my dissertation research is social vulnerability theory, grounded theory, and then of course, critical theory. And so from each one of those connections, I've really found that it digs deep into the issues. So if I have one problem, I can figure out what's the nitty bitty, what's A plus B plus C equals D, and why is D equals A, and all the little mathematical terms. And I think once you figure out what's the little key part of what the issue is, then you can build outward. But if you just go in with the intentions of, oh, well, I'm going to change this because that's what I want to do, well, it's not going to be effective. Or if it is, it still won't be as big or as great as it has the potential to be.
And I'd say social vulnerability is also, the key theory that I rely on in my work. And that's the idea that people aren't vulnerable by accident, that there are social institutions, social structures are what creates vulnerability, especially in terms of hazards and disasters impact. So in looking at incarcerated populations, that these decisions that we make about criminal justice policy that we think are so different, so separate from our field or separate from environmental issues, they determine, how those populations are going to be impacted and determine the health of them as individuals and of their communities. And the idea that the way that we incarcerate people, the number of people that we incarcerate, the extent to which we police communities ends up, determining these impacts of hazards and who is impacted by hazards. So when we look at incarcerated populations, that it is the communities that we know are disproportionately impacted by other hazards and disasters that are also over-policed and end up representing a disproportionate amount of incarcerated people. So out in the community, they're experiencing disproportionate harm. And then through the criminal justice system, they're subjected to another type of disproportional harm. And that looks different in a lot of ways, but it's been overlooked in many ways. But when looking at it from a social vulnerability understanding, it's the idea that it doesn't happen by accident. And when you know that it's not happening by accident, we know that we have agency over it, that we can make decisions. And right now we're at a critical point in terms of COVID impacts and disaster impacts, and looking at what does the future of our criminal justice system look like. And in the past, people did not maybe think that climate justice or environmental justice had a significant role in those decisions. But when we look at the impacts and we look at what the harm that happens and how we run these systems and who ends up being caught up in these systems, we know that we do have something to say about it, and we can inform those policies to reduce harm and to reduce the loss of life and reduce the impact to health, not just for individuals, but also the communities from which they come from.
I wanted to address a question. I think I did it incorrectly, and I don't know if, Michelle, you were going to do this, but I was reading a question in the chat and I clicked something wrong and it said—
It's like that you answered it already. So, but if, yeah, we have some questions in the chat now, so we can go ahead and move to that. And Deidre's very excited about one question, so we'll go ahead and do that one first, and then we'll move on from there. So this question is from Stephen Miner. And it says, I know many of these environmental justice issues and environmental issues in general have been occurring for many years, but it seems that recently we're seeing a growing movement for change across the country and across the world. This may or may not be a simple question, but do you all see hope for the future? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Or is this something that will be a continuous issue over time? maybe it's just me searching for hope, but it's also something that's always on my mind as an environmentalist.
Yeah. And I think the hope part got me first when I just read it, like, just Stephen, don't lose hope, you know? And I know a lot of these things seem extremely new to many of us because they are new to us, but those who have come before us, who are still here and who was here 200 years ago dealing with other issues, these things are occurring, and in our lifetime, they're before our eyes, and the next generation, there'll be things before their eyes. So one, don't lose hope. But two, I think back on Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, and that, along with Cesar Chavez, along with Dr. Martin Luther King, and the things that they were fighting for, even still during that time, environmental justice issues, social justice issues, recognizing that things were occurring in our communities and we didn't have, regulations, and people were dying, but we, did have a decade of regulations throughout the 70s that came through, and even now, as things, as they did before, began to bubble up to the surface again, and people began to recognize we can go to the next step of trying to combat or mitigate these things. So one, don't lose hope. Two, we need as many people to expose things, and then the mental capacity to work together, if that's increasing technology, increasing the level of regulations that will occur at these levels. It can happen. Yes, things are being exposed now, but as my grandma used to say, keep on living, because there's still a lot more that we'll probably see, but don't lose hope.
Does anyone else see hope in our future or have thoughts on what is?
I definitely see a lot of hope. We see a lot of more conversations now about looking at the injustice of, for me in my work, looking at the injustice that happens in our criminal justice system, and humanizing a population that is often dehumanized, and seeing the humanity in people who are incarcerated, and having, there's a lot of conversations about reform, but a lot of people, no matter what they think the future of the criminal justice system is, are wanting to have conversations about the harm that happens in communities and for individuals, whether it's looking at incarcerated incarcerated firefighters who are out fighting, wildfires as we're speaking in California and Colorado and Washington, and saying, hey, our policies don't allow them to go and use that to actually get a job after they leave. And there's been enormous attention to issues like that to change policy. And a lot of that is recognizing that there is this exploitation that happens, and there is a lot of attention and a lot of conversation that's happening, and people, I think, are definitely opening their eyes to, what does a future look like where everyone has the ability to be healthy and live in their communities and have healthy communities, and regardless of whether they have a criminal record or not, or looking at communities and understanding why certain communities are targeted for policing when other communities are not, and looking at the lack of access of resources. I see a lot of those conversations happening where people are more open to understanding what's really going on, instead of just throwing different responses at it, but being very thoughtful, and what is a response we can have that recognizes the humanity of everyone who's involved in these policies.
And just to follow up with what Carly said, I think number one, change starts with you. So if you see something, say something. Or if you're in an environment where Maybe you have a relative or a friend or something and they have an environmental justice issue. Well, then help them, talk to the right politician or the right lawyer or whatever to get the resources that they need. Or if it's not environmental justice as far as like a chemical plant exploding, but maybe hurricanes, direct them to the right resources so they can be successful. I think in life, there'll always be some kind of issue that we'll need to mitigate. If it's not this one, it's going to be something else, but we can take those tools and be able to apply it to the ones that as they come up. So as far as hope, I think it goes back to the fact that change starts with you. So if you're not going to do something, well, the person next to you is not going to do something either. So if you see a problem, do something about it. And whatever the research that you're studying or whatever you're doing, be successful in that field. Everybody can't do everything. Like I hate GIS, but I have a friend who loves GIS. So I can call her at any time and she can help me. So, but what I can do is I can talk to people, right? Like I'm really good at that. So I can be successful in translating her maps to the rest of the community. I can be successful, in developing those, what I'm good at. And so I think when it turns into hope, and even what Dr. Davis said about like Martin Luther King and some of those other people, like they were leaders. What did they do? They led. And so like the people behind them who had the great resources and other activities that they were good at, they fell in line and we were able to see the changes that we have today. So that's one of the things that I would say in terms of that question.
Great, excellent. All right, so another question we have from the chat from Cooper Goodman. I'm gonna summarize it a little bit here. And this goes to Claire specifically. So how do you see the current neoliberal narrative of technological optimism, such as around, switching to electricity for transportation versus gas transportation, and the future of external environmental and social costs? So thinking about unregulated resource extraction that connects across the world, and how will the anticipated switch in our global energy resource economy, how will that lessen or exacerbate some of these impacts of extraction, especially for communities that are already facing injustices?
Okay, so this one came to me. Well, obviously this is like a huge question, but I think the basic point that's being made is a really good one, that sometimes people think that there's a kind of no cost possible change, so that you could kind of move from oil and gas towards electricity, and actually, that will be, it's a good thing, and there won't be people that are much worse off because of those changes. And plainly, in fact, I actually just recently was listening to a podcast about cobalt mining and the impacts that it has on the local communities that are nearby. So, obviously, the pollution that comes from, and the environmental destruction from mining these minerals that are needed in order to create and so on, electricity, on large scale, especially for cars, is really dramatic. And so, so I think there are two questions here. There's a question about transportation, and then there's a question about general energy change. And so automotive transportation, this is a real bugbear of mine. So I think that is one where there could be really massive changes, especially in the United States. Living in Texas, it's the belly of the beast in terms of automotive transportation, where people are generally driving very large vehicles that are dangerous to people as well as and animals, but are also have very high gas consumption, and there's very little public transport. So there are huge opportunities to reduce energy consumption, and that would include a switch to electricity too, by having fewer private vehicles and more public transport. And that's not a particularly popular view in these parts, but obviously I'm a European, and as you can no doubt tell from my accent, so coming to a place where there are no trains, or there is a train but you can't get on it, even worse, you just have to listen to it. And now I'm being drowned by an airplane, so there you go. So I think there are lots of possibilities for reducing energy consumption around transportation specifically. And so that would lessen the impacts on things like mining of cobalt and various other things. But in general, I think that it is a matter of, there is no option really here but choosing between two evils, where one is going to be worse than the other, and that the effects of climate change on all of these communities are likely to be pretty bad. And so it would be better to switch to other minerals and then try to protect people's rights and so on while those mining activities are going on. So, I mean, to try to do the things that have to be done in a way that's more respectful of communities and rights, and engages them in discussions about, you know, what's this going to look like, you know, what are the impacts on the community going to be. So all the aspects of distributive recognition and participative justice. So I guess that's all I can say on that massive but excellent question.
Great, thank you, Claire. So in some similar, along a similar line, the next question is general to the group of how do we reconcile corporate greed and climate justice? At the end of the day, the livelihood of many local economies in underserved regions depends on businesses and corporations that pollute the environment, such as workers in refineries, spend money at diners, buy at local shops, use gas stations. If these corporations are told to close and move, what can be done to fill in the resulting economic gap?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? You know, it makes me think about when I was out surveying with some other colleagues a while back, and the community that we were researching, we got a bit of pushback from some residents, and come to find out they were employed by the company that we were discussing. And those are the issues that many of these communities, especially these communities that are filled with industry, you know, many of them, you know, many residents may actually be very employed and paid generously by many of these companies. And so I don't know if reconcile is the right word, because that means kind of making amends or coming to some sort of truth, I guess. That's something that's going to happen within themselves. You know, are they willing to take the risk of allowing their family to stay in this area, to live comfortably, but maybe have a shortened lifespan because of the things that may be introduced into your physical system? And these are things that men and women in these communities have to, I guess, reconcile within themselves, because it is occurring. Many of these industries are, in fact, greatly employing some of the people who live right there in those communities. You know, and even if many of those people decided to leave some of these areas where the industries are, if someone wanted to sell there, if they're in a fence line community, their property values are probably really low, meaning that if they do try to sell their home, they're probably not going to get anything near what they purchased it for, you know? So it becomes this battle between the person that they're going to have to, you know, come to some sort of decision for themselves and their family. And that's a tough one to think about.
I like this question. It's kind of interesting because, so I grew up, like I said, in the fence line community in Louisiana along the Mississippi River. We were there first. We had industry, like we had an economic way of prospering first. Before the industries came in, they were successful. However, industries came in and kind of changed the economy that exists now. I mean, specifically from Baton Rouge all the way to New Orleans, it's a little bit differently. But then you have communities like what's called Norco, which is really close to New Orleans, and they want those chemical plants out and they have a way to withstand their economy. And so I think it depends specifically on what community you're talking about, what those communities want, and how they want and how they plan on being successful. And if you're going into a community and you're saying, well, I want this chemical plant out, and you should too. Well, that's a bad way of being, because they may not even want them out. So you need to go figure out what the community wants within themselves, figure out what kind of strategies that you can develop so that way they can exit out of the community successful, and that you have another type of economy that comes in to replace that chemical plant or whatever it is that you're trying to remove. You can't just go into a community and say, get out. Like, that's not how it works. So like if you're working with communities like Norco or St. James or Geismar or St. Gabriel, who wants those industries out, and they want to be able to replace them with something successful, another type of industry, then, that's one way to solve that question or answer that question. But if you're working with bigger industries like Baton Rouge, so Baton Rouge, they don't want those chemical plants directly out. They want them heavily regulated so that people don't get cancer, but they may not want them to be removed, because then you remove the entire economy out of an area. So that question, it depends on the community that you're working with and the city that you're in.
Great. Yeah, and I think that question, as chair, I'll use my discretion here to add on, but also the thinking about, and when we think about community resilience to any type of hazard, a diversified economy improves resilience. So oftentimes we're talking about these communities that are reliant solely on not just one industry, sometimes one specific facility, and that inherently, no matter what, reduces their resilience to external pressures and hazards, from climate change to hurricanes to flooding. So just by promoting economic diversity, we could increase resilience in those ways. And then that also provides more economy and jobs that makes them less dependent. But then we get into, okay, well, now the community might be more willing to say, you can go, you got to go. We have other opportunities now. All right.
But I guess that comes with an education piece too, because if people don't recognize that or understand, diversifying the economy and, what that looks like, they can be extremely hesitant, because guess what? All they've known is a factory or, whatever it is. And it's been here as long as they can live, as long as they've lived, that's all they know. So yeah, there's a great need for a piece of education in this process as well for these communities.
Another thing, just to follow up with what Dr. Davis said about education. So one of the biggest things that I'm, I guess, really big on is education. So it may not be in the form of, let me train you how to be prepared for a disaster, but in communities like Geismar and St. Gabriel and all the rest of them, they're heavily recruiting to work at a chemical plant, but they don't tell them all the impacts that happens whenever you work at a chemical plant or you come to live in that area. So I think just as heavy how they can recruit heavily to work at an industry, you can recruit heavily to become a teacher. You can recruit heavily to become a planner and some of those other things. Some of the things that I had talked to Dr. Maya about, I think she asked me, how do you recruit people to urban planning, and especially people of color? Well, number one, we don't know about that. Like, you go into our communities, we've never heard of an urban planner. I go home and I tell my mom, I'm going to be an urban planner. She's like, what's that? I don't want that sounds stupid. But when I explained to her, I'm like, okay, and it's to make a difference. It's to be, to look at disaster, do research. She's like, I didn't even know that was a thing. And I'm like, if my mom doesn't know it's a thing, well, how do I expect her kids to know it's a thing, or anybody else? So if you don't teach me, how do you expect me to know? And so when you talk about, okay, you go into these communities and you want to make a difference, education is truly key in terms of building the cognitive capacity for them to be able to stand within themselves. Because if I don't know, I can't do. So that's something I think that needs to be taken away from a lot of these conversations, is just being able to educate people that looks like me or looks like Dr. Davis or some of the other people of color.
Great. All right, our next question in the chat is, for those who are studying the coastal Texas areas, are there any current proposals or urban planning methods being used to mitigate hurricane and flood damage that are new? And then, are levee systems reliable? So are we seeing innovation in this area to reduce some of these hazard impacts to especially coastal Texas?
Well, I can't speak specifically to Texas in terms of that area because my project doesn't do that exactly. But I know after Hurricane Katrina, we did structural mitigation projects. And so they worked on like stuff like amphibious housing. So like when like having a house be able to float from the ground up whenever there's water, you know, there's flood levels coming in. They've worked on how do you rebuild a house or restructure it so that you have water can either flow through it or around it to protect it. So I can't speak specifically to Texas, but there are areas where you see innovation in terms of like how houses are being built and how do we work with the land? How do we go into like coastal areas? And so like during Christmas, we all get real Christmas trees, right? So if we take those real Christmas trees, instead of putting them on the corner to just get thrown into the dump, like we take those and put them into places like the marshland, so that way beavers and some of those habitats can regrow again, right? So there's a lot of things that are going on that are very innovative. We may not always talk about them, but they're there, especially if you look up like coastal restoration projects. So that's something of interest that may answer that question.
You know, and something's coming to mind right now, and I vaguely remember it, but I think after Hurricane Harvey, and you guys, audience members, can look this up a little more, but when we were on a quick tour, just looking at the area in Galena Park recently, remember I told you guys a little bit about Magellan and that they leaked all this gallons of gasoline, and we were driving on this, not necessarily a bridge, but like this overpass in the area, and the driver said, "This is new. They just built this because of the issue that happened with Harvey and Magellan leaking to kind of make a greater transportation route out of this area in the event, unfortunately, that it happened again. They've built this overpass connecting or to allow people from Galena Park to kind of get out of the city. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I just thought about that from the conversation that I had when I was in Galena Park recently.
Yeah, it definitely is an area that is working a lot on innovation, but hopefully we'll see some things that are happening there. It is slow to innovate on that massive a scale, though, I would say. All right, our next question, we got about 10 minutes left here. So our next question is also to Dr. Palmer from Daniel Pilgreen. It says, it seems like we have some ongoing struggles with extending climate empathy to other groups of people, such as environmental refugees. Are there common grounds among marginalized communities in the present, future communities, and different species that we can use to leverage and argue for an extension of environmental justice and action to these groups?
Okay, so I mean, I think this is another great question. And when I read it, it kind of put me in mind, there's a book called In a Different Voice by Carol Gilligan, and she talks about two kind of visions of how we might approach ethics. There's a kind of voice of justice and a voice of care, right? And what's interesting in this question is that Dan's asking about empathy, which is really like the voice of care, I guess, and then also about justice. And those are kind of different ways I think of thinking about ethics. So one of the problems in the cases that's being talked about is that, I mean, there's lots of research that people find it much easier to empathize with other people that are much more like them. And so one of the worries about empathy is that people who will tend to empathize with people that look like them and have the same kinds of backgrounds as them, and to be much less empathetic with people that are more distant from them in various ways. So I think extending empathy is going to be difficult to those groups like future people and environmental refugees if they don't look like you and seem like you. And that's a place where the language of justice is probably going to be more useful than the language of empathy. Although there are ways of trying to portray people that are not like you as being more like you, and that might get people to feel more empathetic. But in the case of especially sort of future people where they're just not here yet, And I think also animals, especially if they're not kind of cuddly ones like polar bears, but they're, you know, amphibians or fish or something that people feel very distant from, you would have to use a language of justice, and that would take the form of, I guess, of saying things like, well, you know, these beings, especially if they're all of these sentient animals and humans, you know, they can suffer pain, you know, their lives matter to them, what happens to them matters to them, in the similar ways to the way that things matter to you. I mean, other than that, it's very difficult. I mean, that's one of the fundamental problems with climate change, is that those who are most affected are those from whom one is most distanced, especially future people. So, I mean, so it's a great question, and I don't have any great answer, but maybe other people on the panel do.
I would say that's something that, you know, I experience in my work is coming up against a lack of empathy or stigma for incarcerated persons broadly. And then you do come across, there are, you know, the idea that exposure to hazards is part of punishment. So for example, in Texas, there are very few prisons in Texas that have air conditioning. So they're not required in Texas prisons. So there's more than 100 prison institutions in Texas, and more than 70 of them do not have air conditioning. And it gets very hot here. And every year there's a number of incarcerated persons that get very sick or even die every year from extreme heat and heat-related illness. And there's a difficulty in building up kind of attention to that issue. And with climate change, the days are getting hotter. The number of days that are over 100 degrees are becoming more frequent. And that's something that many organizations that are working on that issue struggle to do, is trying to get people to be empathetic and understand, you know, what the impact means, and that no matter what any person has done, that they deserve life and they deserve to be healthy, and that exposure to hazards and exposure to extreme heat is inhumane and an unacceptable form of punishment. But you will see officials and politicians say they don't deserve air conditioning, that to put that cost and spend that money on prisoners is irresponsible, or they're undeserving of that type of money and attention. And but they bring that issue to people's minds and put a face on the issue as these are people, these are human beings. And when you have policies that allow that kind of harm, there's a reverberating impact on that person, on their families, on their communities. There's a human cost, a social cost. And do we find it acceptable that our institutions allow physical harm, to be part of our punishment systems? But that is one of the struggles in advocating for incarcerated people, is getting past this idea that they don't deserve resources, or that they do deserve to be in these harsh conditions. And Texas is one of 13 states that does not air condition its prisons. And as we continue, every year it becomes a more extreme and more dire situation. But there are many organizations that are working to get prisoner stories out, to tell their stories, to share their letters, to share their voices, to say, this is what it's like for someone to be in a cell, a concrete block, when it's 105, 109 degrees outside. And that is kind of their main strategy, is to get the issue in front of people, because once people see and hear and make a human connection with the impact, that's where they've seen and a lot of the empathy building and a lot of the support building for policy change.
Great, thank you. So I believe we're at time. We had one question left that we didn't get to. I'm looking to Emily on whether we should go ahead and close or go ahead and answer the last question.
Sure, why don't we just do so quickly? Yeah.
All right, so our last question comes from Sanju Jang. It is social capital of communities sometimes exacerbates equity issues. So how do we wisely utilize and leverage social capital to address systematic justice issues?
So, oh, go ahead.
No, I'm quickly thinking about just back on education and empowerment and the idea that, you know, these communities, these group of people vested or shared in this commonality, there's a level of education and also empowerment that needs to go within these communities. Because sure, it can in some ways exacerbate issues of inequity. But once there's exposure, education, and empowerment to step outside of that realm, of that community, of those conditions, to bring in the things, to bring in investments and whatever's needed, you know, within these communities or for their community.
Yeah, great. I think the question kind of relates to the earlier point about extending empathy outside of ourselves and how can we build these, you know, broader coalitions, broader networks, broader support within communities to have diverse perspectives brought forth, understand them, and kind of then address those issues. And we also heard from everyone on the panel about participation and voice and having everyone in a community have some sort of agency to engage in hazard mitigation and addressing environmental issues in their communities. And we know that that's a very challenging task in and of itself, but that participation can prove fruitful. So I would like everyone to join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion and bringing this variety of perspectives here together on coastal justice and what we're facing here now and into the future. So thank you each. This was a wonderful time and wonderful presentations. And I thank everyone for joining us today on their Friday afternoon. And yeah, I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. I'll hand over to Emily to close us out.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for such a rich and engaging discussion, which for me has really increased my understanding of coastal communities and environmental justice and climate change. And many thanks to our speakers and their expertise, which brings together the social sciences and the humanities for a really fruitful conversation. I also thank the audience for such wonderful questions, which got our discussion going. So let me just, before we close, remind you that we have one more event in this series, and that will be Dr. Leslie Mabin, who will be bringing some of these issues around resilience and energy and justice and hazards into the context of Japan and in the wake of the Fukushima disaster. So he'll be giving us a lecture next Friday. Check our website for details, and we hope to see you there. But thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Meyer, for chairing our event today, and thank you to our speakers. Okay, bye for now.